Hey friends, it's Lauren here at Mill City Roasters. I wanted to do a quick video and talk to everyone about cold brew. As you know, it's starting to get warm out. It's warming up in most parts of the US. And as it gets warm here in Minneapolis, we are drinking a lot more cold brew and roasting a lot more cold brew. We have a toll roasting program that we operate here in our roastery where we support cafes and other wholesale roasters who are looking to scale up or bring in their own brand. And one of the coffees in our toll roasting lineup is cold brew. Now you've probably heard of cold brew before, and I'm guessing most people have a general idea of what it is, but just in case, to cover all of our bases, I want to explain that cold brew is a very long extraction method. Typically takes about 24 hours, but the time range can vary a little bit. And it is a method that uses room temperature or slightly cool water and very, very coarse ground coffee at a very high ratio. If you've seen cold brew on the menu at cafes or restaurants, what you've probably seen is a diluted cold brew. What you make when you brew cold brew is a concentrate. You can use that concentrate in a lot of different applications. And in my next video, I'm going to talk about a few kind of creative applications for cold brew concentrate and cold brew beverages on your menu for the summer. What I wanted to do in this first video was talk about some small format cold brew devices and also sort of just walk through the steps of cold brew. And the last thing I want to do is talk about what we put in our cold brew blends and coffees that I think work really well in a cold brew application. Cool, so let's get started. A lot of people think that in order to make cold brew you need fancy equipment, and I guess you do and you don't. You can buy dedicated cold brewers like this Toddy cold brew system, which is kind of nice because it's both a cold brewer and a serving carafe. It comes with a lid, and it utilizes a nice felt filter, which really cleans up the body of the cold brew and removes any small particulate. The way that you would use a system like this is you might insert a heavy bound paper filter into the upper chamber, and then add your ground coffee, your cool water, give it a stir to make sure everything is saturated, and then leave it on the counter just like this for about a day. Cold brew time frames range, as I said, anywhere on the shorter end of maybe 8 to 12 hours and on the higher end of 22 to 24 hours. Once your cold brew is complete and you're done brewing, you would remove the stopper that would be placed down here, and you would drain it over this carafe, and then your cold brew concentrate would be in this carafe. You can store it in the fridge for up to 2 weeks. This is going to be a great method for anyone drinking cold brew at home or for a really low volume cafe. Maybe you have a couple of these on the counter. You don't, as I said, need to buy a specific dedicated brewer to make cold brew, but this is a great option if you choose to use it. The way that I make cold brew at home most often is in really, really simple ways, like I utilize a French press, a mason jar, or even a pitcher like the one that I'm going to be using today to pour water out of. Because cold brew is a full immersion brew method, you can basically use any vessel that's capable of holding the amount of coffee and water that you want, and then you just need a way to strain the coffee out of the water at the end of the brew cycle. To show you what that looks like on a French press, let's start with this one. So the ratio that I'm going to use for cold brew, basically across all of these brewing methods and into the larger commercial size brewers that I'll show in our next video, is a pretty high ratio of coffee to water. When I worked in commercial cafes, high volume retail cafes, we used a whole 5-gallon bag, which is what you see here, 5-pound bag, and brewed a whole 5-gallon bucket of cold brew. Sometimes you'll hear people use the term toddy interchangeably with cold brew. Toddy is a brand name. They made this brewer, but I think it's kind of become ubiquitous as like a cold brew term. So we used a commercial toddy bucket, 5 pounds of coffee, ground coarse like a French press grind, and 5 gallons of filtered water. On a smaller scale, that ratio minimizes down to about 1 ounce of ground coffee for every 8 ounces of cool water. So for both the French press and the mason jar today, I'm going to do 2 ounces of coffee, ground coarse, and 16 ounces of cool water. So all that I'm going to do here is pour a little bit of water, just enough to get it started. This is actually really similar to what my French press recipe looks like, where I give it a little bit of a stir to make sure that I don't have any dry pockets. And then I fill up the French press. Just using a scale here so that I can really hit that 16-ounce mark. And then I'm going to put the plunger in the French press, but just to the top of where the coffee is. Just like that. Same thing again for the mason jar. I've got 2 ounces of ground coffee in there. Start with a little bit of water. Quick stir. This gets a lot harder when you've got a lot more coffee. But with 2 ounces, it's pretty easy. And fill it up. Place the lid on. Now, I can store both of these on the countertop for 24 hours. When I'm ready to strain the cold brew tomorrow, at this time, I'm just going to plunge the French press plunger all the way down and pour this into a decanter, another serving vessel, something like that. For this mason jar, I'm going to have to use a fine mesh sieve or maybe a coffee filter or something else to sort of filter it through. But with both of these applications, I'm going to be left with the same great high quality cold brew concentrate, which I can then cut 1-to-1 with water. That is a very, very common dilution ratio. So it means if I was serving a large cold brew in a to-go cup, like a 16-ounce to-go cup, I would pour probably 4 to 5 ounces of the concentrate, 4 to 5 ounces of the water, and then fill the cup up with ice. The cold brew concentrate is really strong in flavor. And cold brew, kind of by definition, because it's such a long brewing method, it really minimizes perceived acidity, and it increases a very heavy syrupy body and sweetness. Also, because it's such a long extraction method, cold brew contains more caffeine by volume than a regular brewed cup of coffee. Both the strength of flavor and the higher caffeine content are a good reason to dilute your cold brew concentrate. Now, I have had, and maybe you have had too, customers who asked for the cold brew that they ordered to be uncut or undiluted. Some people just really like that intense flavor. Some people are planning to add a lot of cream and sugar to it. Whatever reason that they want is fine, but you want to remember to work that into your pricing, because what they're getting is essentially enough cold brew for 2 cups of cold brew. So sometimes we would have to apply a slight upcharge to account for the cost of that product. Next, I want to talk about the type of coffee that we use for cold brew. So as I mentioned, because this brew method really minimizes acidity and tends to increase the perception of heavier body, syrupy sweetness, it doesn't make sense to me to use a super light or super bright coffee for cold brew. During that long extraction, you're really going to minimize that perceived acidity. And if you're starting with a coffee that's really lemony, zesty, and lively, you're going to lose a lot of those flavors in the cold brew. And at that point, it's a little bit of a waste for that coffee specifically. What I like most about cold brew is that no matter what coffee you start with, you end up with a flavor concentrate that is fairly chocolatey, nutty, and sweet. And so I tend to like to use coffees that start out with those flavors as primary tasting notes. What we use for our cold brew concentrate is a three bean pre-blend. We use a natural Brazil, a washed Peru, and a natural Ethiopia. That Brazil shows up in a lot of our blends, both our espresso blend, one of our dark roast blends, and there's good reason for it. It's a really solid, long-lasting, affordable coffee that has really great base notes. It tastes nutty and chocolatey, kind of like a Reese's peanut butter cup, and it just provides a really great foundational flavor that you can build other flavors on top of. That Brazil is available on our website, and it's just like a workhorse Like I said, we see it show up in a lot of places in our toll roasting program and in our green coffee blends. The Peru that we use is a great regional select washed Peru. It has notes of blackberry, cola, chocolate, and red fruit. You can already tell from those descriptors how the cold brew method is really going to emphasize and highlight those notes to create just like a really lovely sweetness, dark, rich chocolate, and syrupy body. Finally, the natural is kind of the secret weapon in the cold brew. And I recommend that people try out a little bit of a natural component in their cold brew blends if they're building one for themselves. Naturals are inherently fruity, they can be funky, they can be explosive, and they do have a little bit of a pleasant brightness. They can kind of add pop or excitement to your blends. When you cold brew a natural processed coffee, especially one from Ethiopia, the acidity is sort of reined in and controlled, and the fruit flavors turn very sort of jammy, almost like fruit that's been cooked down or fruit that's been coated in chocolate. It really comes through in this cold brew, especially as very, very dark berries, again like blackberry notes or super ripe strawberries, and it just adds that sweetness that makes this coffee concentrate really, really nice, especially if you're someone who likes to add a little cream or a little sugar or maybe a pump of vanilla or some other flavor to your cold brew. That fruitiness still really comes through, and it makes the coffee more interesting than what you might get if you were just using natural or more kind of generic kind of chocolatey and nutty flavors. So that's our cold brew blend, 33% of each, Brazil, Peru, and a natural Ethiopia. Like I said, this is a template that we tend to recommend to others, and even just recently helped work with a customer and design different blends for them, and their cold brew blend ended up being very similar, where it was maybe 60 or 70% of a Brazil and another 30 or 40% of a different natural Ethiopia. It worked really well as a cold brew, and it was a really great drip coffee cup as well. One last thing I like to mention, and we talk about this sometimes in our roasting courses. When you think about kind of ordering coffee for different applications, whether it's an espresso blend, a cold brew blend, or something else, you want to make sure that you have areas in your menu that can be a home for coffees that need a home. Sometimes you have green coffee that is getting a little bit old and you need to kind of move through it a little faster. Cold brew would be a great place for it, because cold brew is not going to highlight every single, tiny, minute, nuanced flavor of a coffee. It's going to give you a broad swath of what that coffee sort of tastes like. Another good place for cold brew is with roasts that don't quite go to spec, especially roasts that go a little bit longer than you had planned or maybe slightly darker than you had planned. This has happened to all of us where we're trying to manage energy in a roast and maybe our machine was a little bit too hot to start. It's at the end of our roasting day, or we got distracted by a roast and we missed a temperature change or a gas adjustment where we tried to remove energy from the roast and that didn't happen. Suddenly our roast is going to be going a lot longer than we expected and finishing at a different finish temp. We always recommend taking that coffee to the cupping table and trying it and seeing if it will still work for the application that you intended. But if it's gotten a little bit dull or a little bit flat as a result of that roast accident, cold brew is a great place to try it out. You can blend a little bit of that into your house cold brew blend, and I'm betting that you won't be able to pick up that air once it's been brewed slowly with cool water for 24 hours. These are just a couple of my little tips and tricks about brewing small volumes of cold brew and which coffees to use. Keep a lookout for a next video where I'm going to show a big commercial size toddy brewer, and we're going to brew enough cold brew to serve a whole cafe. And I'm also going to show you how to use your batch brewer to make flash ice brew, which is a very quick cold coffee that's brewed with hot water. We'll also talk in that video about some fun things you can do with cold brew concentrate and how you can incorporate cold brew onto your summer menu for seasonal specials. So if you like this video, let us know, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.